Oh, there's Rich. This is great. All the students here. Everyone here.
No, there's some coercion involved.
I was about to say. I didn't hear that.
They all had to attend yesterday afternoon.
Okay.
And then they're also expected to attend one of today's.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
But there are
I
a good
mean,
number of community members.
that's really good too. Really good. Sorry, I didn't make it to the movie last night. I was beat.
I think Dave and I were the only ones. From the Philly speakers.
Oh.
I didn't see him there. But he might have been.
I felt really bad because I'm like,
Test 1 2. Dr. Frank, can you hear me? Oh, I'll send you a new link.
I go to bed at 9 most nights.
Yep.
Get started. Well, good afternoon and welcome to everyone to the third panel of the day. We've been hearing quite a bit about military history and grand strategy, and with this panel, we will transition to the larger context of the war, America's transition to peacetime. We have three panelists. The first is Stephanie Hinnershitz. Steph Hinnershitz is Assistant Professor of Security and Military Studies at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. She holds a PhD in American history from the University of Maryland and has previously served as senior historian with the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Dr. John Moser is probably the one person in this room that everyone is guaranteed to know. I think the connection, everyone here probably has some connection to Dr. Moser, so he really needs no introduction, but he is Professor of History and Chair of the History and Political Science Department here at Ashland University. He's the author of 4 books, including The Global Great Depression and the Coming of World War II. And in fact, he teaches our AU course on World War II. So no doubt could speak on many aspects of the topics covered at this conference, but today is going to be talking about the wartime economy and its aftermath, the depression that didn't happen. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Chris Burkett, who teaches political science here as an associate professor of political science here at AU, and it probably is well known to many of you in this room, the students that is, because he's also director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program, and he holds a PhD from the University of Dallas. So without further ado, Dr. Hinnershitz.
All right, thank you everyone for being here. I have to do my disclaimer. So the views that I have are not representative of the Air Force, Maxwell Air Force Base, what is soon to be formerly known as the Department of Defense. So these are all my own views, and all the research that I've done for this, I've done on my own time and is not connected in any way with my employer. All right, so what I'm going to talk with you about today is the GI Bill and how really it came to redefine a lot of things in the United States, but more specifically, I want to focus on how it changed what it meant to be a veteran and how we actually define who a veteran is and then why. So I want to start off with a quote up here. You can take a look at that. It is from FDR, 1935. And this is something that he delivers in an address before Congress. And what he is doing is he is explaining why he vetoed a bill that would give World War I veterans immediate payouts. So this is what he is explaining to Congress. He's basically saying that because someone is able-bodied and they served during the war, that does not mean that they should get any other treatment or any other financial assistance than any other able-bodied person in the United States. So this is actually really interesting. Go back there really quick, because there is going to be a big shift in not just how he views service, but how a lot of high-ranking officials, politicians, and even just regular Americans view service. So I'm gonna trace that, and I bring this up not to vilify FDR. So don't take this as FDR hated veterans. Don't say that, don't meme that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's something very, very important that shifted over time. And really what we're going to get to is probably one of the most successful and largest social welfare programs, and that is the GI Bill. So it is, a lot of people would say, enormously successful in what it does. And like I'm going to show you basically how it helps to reimagine what we mean by a veteran. But to go back, like a lot of other people who you've heard from, scholars, you have to go back a little bit before the war. So this is an end of the war conference, but we're going to start a little bit before and move throughout because it's very important to understand how the GI Bill comes to be. So when FDR delivers that address, delivers those remarks before Congress, he is influenced by a couple different veterans benefits programs that come out of World War I. Veterans assistance has a much longer history in the United States than World War I, but these are the things that will most deliberately and explicitly inform what he is going to do. So with World War I veterans, there's not a lot of assistance for them. There are charitable organizations and associations, a very important organization that will come out of World War I, the American Legion. They're doing a lot of work for veterans. But as far as massive funding, spending programs like what the GI Bill will become, we don't really have that. So for World War I veterans who served, they will be able to lobby and they will be able to get some cash assistance, but it will be well in the future. So apart from programs that were designed to help disabled veterans, so men who return home from serving and they are unable to work right away because they are not, quote, able-bodied. They're not able to do that. There are assistance programs that are given to them for training. So helping them get some kind of training so they can rehabilitate themselves and basically go on and care for themselves and be financially stable. Other than that, though, you don't see things like what you will see with the GI Bill. Not to give a spoiler alert, but things are very different for veterans in terms of assistance. What they are able to get with help of the American Legion, which becomes a really massive lobbying force both after World War I and after World War II, is they are able to push Congress to devise what is known as the bonus bill. So if this sounds familiar to you, you probably know of it from like the bonus march on DC during the Depression. So the bonus bill is the unofficial name of what is the Adjustment Act of 1924. Congress, when they passed this act, they wanted to be very careful not to call it a bonus because they didn't want it to seem like something that was a handout. So they wanted to focus on it being an adjustment act, but it does become known as the bonus bill. There's a lot of intricacies to this. Let me just try and summarize it as best as I can. So for men who served during World War I, they get paid. So they got paid about $30 a month. Don't ask me what that calculates to today. I don't know, but someone can do it. Someone might have a phone and they might do it. So we'll come back to that at the end. But they get paid $30 a month. That's your average private. Domestic workers, so people who worked in wartime industries, they actually ended up making more than your average private who served. So the argument from the Legion is that these men lost out on making some extra money while they were serving and fighting for their country. So when they come back, the idea is that the government should give them a bonus, something that will help to supplement the money that they earned during the war for fairness, for equity, trying to make up for some of that lost time and lost money. So the bonus are these certificates. And if you served for a certain number of days, you got paid a certain amount of money. So basically it comes out to like $1 a day and $1.25 a day, depending on if you served overseas or at home. If you served and you made about $50 or less under this 1924 Act, you would be paid right away. So you got your certificate, you got your bond right away. If it was more than that, then you would not be able to get it until much later. So basically, ironically, like 1944, 1945. That's when you would actually be able to get those bonus certificates. You could borrow against them, but this was a long-term program. So again, designed to help eventually when they get to old age, they will have some kind of money, build up their savings. And this is all great, but the problem is, this is 1924, so we know what's coming around the corner. We're inching toward the Great Depression, and some of these same men who had been borrowing against these certificates, or they had been waiting patiently, right, trying to figure out and wait, when can they start collecting that money? They're going to need that money right away. But we are not really in that time period yet where there's this forward-thinking, big kind of project, big program that the GI Bill will be. Calvin Coolidge will actually veto this bill, and he'll veto it again, not him, I'm sorry, but later on in 1929, there will be an attempt to try and recalculate this to actually get this money to the veterans sooner rather than later. It's vetoed. And Calvin Coolidge vetoes this one because basically he says that patriotism that is bought and paid for is not patriotism. So think about that. Think about how far we have come, and especially from World War I to World War II. If you go and serve for Calvin Coolidge, it doesn't mean you automatically get any kind of extra money. You do it because you're patriotic. You also do it because you're drafted. But you do it because this is something that you do to serve your country. It does not mean that you are entitled to any other extra benefits, no extra pay. If you're disabled, then yes, we can give you some help, but otherwise, that's not what we're talking about. This is also a fun fact about the 1924 Act. It's also known as the tombstone bonus because the argument was kind of a little joke, is that if you are entitled to one of these bonuses, you won't see it, but your loved ones will when you die. So that's the most when you can hope to see it is when this money is paid out to your family. So this is the picture going into the Depression. And like I said, there are a number of different bills that try to pass in order to try and get these certificates to these men sooner rather than later, but they never really happen. They never materialize. But this starts to take on a pretty bad look as you move through the Depression. So even though the men who served during World War I, these are things that they know, this money, these certificates, they won't be able to get until about 20 years out. People are getting pretty desperate and they are starting to demand immediate payment. They want this money. They start to lobby. The Legion is lobbying on behalf of them, but it's not hitting, right? It's not landing where it should be. So this leads to the bonus march. So again, you probably are familiar with this, but you have a massive group of men who want their cash payments. They march on Washington. Some of the men who we've heard about so far in here, so Patton, MacArthur, and Eisenhower, they are also present at this. It would be an interesting thing, Dr. Campbell, to back it up, right? How did their pre-war experiences maybe shape their leadership? Another paper, another day, another panel. But the bonus march becomes, it's splashed across front page news. FDR realizes that this could actually be very politically beneficial for him because if he can use this in some way to bolster his chances for being elected as president, it will become a black mark on Hoover, President Hoover's career, which it does, but it sets FDR up nicely to respond to something like this. So if we are moving through World War II, and we covered a lot about operational, strategic, tactical elements of World War II, so I'm not going to get like hunkered down into that. But we need to understand, how do we shift from those comments that FDR made before Congress to the GI Bill? It has to do with what is happening during the war. So if anyone got the chance to see the film last night, if you saw the movie, a lot of what I'm going to talk about might sound pretty familiar. So FDR is already planning for the end of the war well before the war is over. You heard that from Dr. Lyon's speech earlier, some of the big conferences, Tehran and Yalta. He's also thinking ahead and planning for what will be happening here in the United States. So when servicemen return home, what is that going to mean for the economy? What is that going to mean for society? There are a lot of big concerns about what is going to happen to men who return and try to readjust. So the Readjustment Act is the official name of the GI Bill. But how are they going to integrate back into society? There are a lot of anxieties about this. Economic anxiety. The Labor Department is predicting high levels of unemployment, right? Just building off of what happened during World War I. There's also social and cultural, so social instability. These are men, it's no secret that serving during war can be a very traumatic thing. And so men who are returning in large numbers, are they going to be mentally fit enough to be able to reintegrate into society? There are fears of a crime wave, right? That there's going to be this massive crime wave. These men are going to come home and from serving, they're not going to know how to kind of behave as civilians again. So you're taking all of these together and you're trying to figure out, is there a way to mitigate so that we don't get something like the bonus march again? That's the other thing. FDR does not want to deal with something like the bonus march. So there is sort of a very pragmatic purpose of this, but it's comprehensive. FDR is taking a very comprehensive view of this to try and figure out, can you start to make changes? And the answer is yes. And the Legion is going to pop up again as early as 1943. There are conversations about some kind of bill or some kind of program to help veterans readjust. And then the Legion will start to heavily lobby, work with some of FDR's advisors. One, her name is Anna Rosenberg. If you don't know that name, you probably should. She actually ends up being the first Assistant Secretary of War under George Marshall. She's one of FDR's very close aides. She goes to Europe and she visits troops who are convalescing, and she basically says, what do you need? When you come home, what do you need from the government? What can we do for you? And the number one thing they usually say is education. They want to go to school. They want to be able to get a college degree. So she brings that back, other surveys that are taken about GIs and what they need. And this gets put into this massive bill. So in 1943, FDR in a fireside chat will basically say that we can start to lift up veterans because that will also help to lift up society. So for him, there's not a difference between veterans who served and then the rest of American society, like there was in 1935. For him, the Legion and others, it's part of the whole thing, right? And you have to help veterans when they return. In doing so, that will help all of American society. So 1944, you do have the Readjustment Act, otherwise known as GI Bill. So you can see that up here. That comes from the Legion. So that's really marketing is not possibly the right word to use, but we'll say marketing. So a marketing tool to try and help it to appeal to people who might actually not be convinced that you need something like the GI Bill. But basically, these are essential things that if you have served, right, you should be entitled to things because you had potentially given up your life for your country and you had served overseas. So not Coolidge's, patriotism that is bought and paid for isn't patriotism. This is something a little bit different. So some of the basic provisions of the GI Bill, I'm going to put these up here. It is huge, right? It does a lot of things for a lot of people and their families who had served. Probably the most important things, assistance with getting home loans. So that's really, really important. It was a complicated process. You had to go through the Veterans Affairs. So that comes out of World War II. There were other versions of this earlier, but the VA really is like a World War II product in terms of how it's consolidated to deal with health and loans, but home loans, business loans, farms, people who never really might have had an opportunity to own property before. Now they're able to get assistance for that. There's disability, there's insurance, there is education, so that's probably one of the big ones, right? But a lot of historians have said, what is the most impactful part of the GI Bill? A lot of pointing to education. That's a huge sort of life changer there. What are the qualifications for this? Well, you have to have served, right? But you have to be honorably discharged. That's going to be very important. We'll come back to that later on. You have to be honorably discharged. Super important. That is a key qualification. Then you also had to have served 90 days between September 1940 and end of the war. That there's an asterisk there because if you got injured and you were disabled, there are some exceptions made for that. But those are the basic qualifications, right? Did you leave your service honorably? And did you serve a certain amount of time? Those are the key characteristics. So this is, again, a little bit different because there is no difference now between a veteran and an average American citizen, right? A veteran is, when they are coming back, they served, and because of their service, we need to reintegrate them into society and help them to become productive members of society again. So a veteran is redefined. What qualifies you? Here are specific qualifications. And then what do you get? You get to participate, right? You return and you are a fully functioning member of American society. There is a short that comes out, a short film in 1946. This is really interesting because there are a number of pamphlets that are created because it's so confusing to actually try and take advantage of these benefits. It is the red tape that is inherent in this program is just mind-blowing. Well, maybe it's not. You can probably imagine. It is not as easy as going back and saying, I'm a veteran, right? And then you get your stuff. There's all kinds of processes that you have to go through, and it's very frustrating. So there needs to be some of these short films and pamphlets that say, here's how you go and do this. Here's what you're entitled to. And this is from one of these films from 1946, but I put it up here because this is a direct quote. how do you help GIs to start their permanent careers, right, as basically American citizens? So not just transactional, here's your money, here's your payment, but what can the government do to turn a veteran from a veteran into sort of an American, a permanent career as a citizen? The GI Bill was not perfect. I just said there's a lot of ways that made it incredibly difficult to take advantage of some of this stuff, but it did do a lot of uplift. So some key veterans here, those who got the opportunity to take advantage of the GI Bill. So Daniel Inouye over there, he is a member of the 442nd. He's injured while serving in Europe. He unfortunately has to have, he loses an arm. So he comes back though, and he is able to take advantage of the GI Bill. He graduates from the University of Hawaii, and then he gets his law degree from George Washington University. He goes on to be the first Asian American representative in the House. So he is from Hawaii. He did not spend any time in an incarceration camp. So that's a huge story, but he did not. He was from Hawaii, so he was not part of that camp. But he comes back, he gets super involved in politics. He starts to lobby for Hawaiian statehood. He's a real key member of that. And then also later on becomes a really important advocate for Japanese American redress. So money that they got once they are out, and then lobbying Congress for that. Medgar Evers is another who is able to take advantage of the GI Bill, which helps him turn his life into some more of like what we would think a kind of middle class life would be. So he is a member of the Quartermaster Corps, serves over in Europe, part of the Red Ball Express. He comes back and he gets his business degree from Alcorn State University, I think it was State College maybe at the time in Mississippi. He goes on to be a powerhouse in the civil rights movement. So probably the best way I can describe sort of what he specialized in is what we might think of today as like organizational culture. So if you get a degree and you understand how organizations function, that's sort of what he specialized in. Then he's able to use that when he takes lead of NAACP chapters in the South and uses his knowledge for that. So these are veterans who are able to take advantage of the GI Bill. Now, there are so many things that make it impossible for others to take advantage of the GI Bill. So one of the key principles that is written into this comes from some Southern senators who make a point of shifting where do the benefits come from. They're going to be managed at the state level. There are plenty of Black veterans who are not able to take advantage of the GI Bill benefits because they don't have access to them. It's kind of difficult to go to any college you want when there is segregation still around. Women are technically also qualified to get GI Bill benefits, but they are also prohibited from going to certain universities that are not co-ed yet. So again, it's very, very tricky. A lot of good, a lot of limitations to it. But what I want to finish up with are some who served who were outwardly denied access to the GI Bill benefits. And then think about what that means. If the whole point is the GI Bill helps us to redefine what a veteran is, it's going to be really important for understanding, well, who is not able to take advantage of this. So one of the first examples up here, this is Melvin Dwork. So he was a sailor during World War II. He joins the Hospital Corps at the Navy. And he has a boyfriend in New Orleans. So he is a gay man, and he writes a lot of letters, right, while he's serving to his boyfriend in New Orleans. His friends tell him to stop it. Like, you should not do this. This is not good. And he is caught. He's actually taking officer training courses in South Carolina at the time, and the MPs come into the room and escort him out. They say, you're exhibiting homosexual behavior. We've heard word of this. And so he is dishonorably discharged from service. That means he is unable to take advantage of the GI Bill benefits. And from that standpoint, he's not a veteran. So under the GI Bill, he is not identified as a veteran. This is something that happens pretty commonly for men and women, but men too, especially who are serving and they are gay. There's also a blue discharge. So that's neither honorable nor dishonorable. It's not bad, but it's not great either, because that means you are not honorably discharged. So a disproportionate number of Black men and gay men are discharged under these blue discharges. That practice was ended in 1947, but for decades, like Melvin, there are those who did not get the benefits. Melvin eventually does, I wouldn't say it was maybe like in the 2010s, I think, when he is actually able to get it. I could be off on that, but it was more recent than not. Another individual, Stanley Wilner. So Stanley Wilner, he served in the Merchant Marine during World War II. He ended up being a POW. It's a really interesting story, which I could go on and on about, but I won't. But he is a POW of the Germans. So he is on a ship that is attacked by basically a U-boat. He gets taken as a German POW. Then he is basically traded to the Japanese and becomes a POW of the Japanese. He ends up working on the Death Railroad. So he ends up going to Burma and he survives somehow, makes it home. He's not considered a veteran. Merchant mariners are not considered veterans until 1988. Why is that? They are considered actually civilian employees. So they actually don't work for the War Department during the war. They're overseen by the War Shipping Administration. So they are not identified as veterans. That's going to be a really long battle. And they finally get it. There's a movement that begins in the late 70s where you start to see other groups like the WASPs, so women pilots during the war, they will be recognized for their service. And basically the merchant marine or merchant mariners start to say we should be able to have benefits as well. So it's this huge push throughout the 1980s. And eventually they do get identified as veterans and they are able to take advantage of the bill. But still, it's not that everyone has the ability to do so, and people who are passing away, right, are not able to take advantage of that as well. So to wrap up some conclusions, I'll just put these up here. So what changes with World War II in terms of veterans? Well, their investments. It's less transactionary. There's a huge emphasis on education, but really there's also a reflection of values. Who is a veteran? Who gets to claim that status? It's not just about the economic benefits. It is also that you are defined in a lot of ways by this bill. It's a really important change. It's very complex. It's very convoluted. But for me, this is one of the key things to come out of World War II is just how we think about veterans and what it means to serve. So I will stop. Yeah.
I feel like I should start out by saying that the views expressed in this paper are not necessarily those of Ashland University, but they really should be. Thanks for that. Oh, give a chance to get into the presentation. Thanks. I'll get started. In 1943, the future Nobel laureate Paul Samuelson, then a young economist working in the Roosevelt administration, wrote that were the war to end suddenly, here we go. Were the war to end suddenly in the next 6 months, were we again planning to wind up our war effort in the greatest haste, to demobilize our armed forces, to liquidate price controls, to shift from astronomical deficits to even the large deficits of the 30s, then there would be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation which any economy has ever faced. This pessimism was common among many professional economists of the time. And when you think about it, it wasn't unreasonable. They all would have looked back to the end of World War I, when there was a very severe, though fortunately brief, recession following that war, as troops that were released from service tried to return to the civilian workforce. This was not a pessimism, however, that was shared by most in the business community. Fortune magazine in May 1944 polled a sample of executives on the question, in general, does it seem to you that after the war, the prospects of your company will be better or worse or about the same as they were before? Among the respondents, 51.2% said better, 36.8% said about the same, only 8.5% said worse. Later that year, the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly entitled, "Is American Business Deluding Itself?" He wrote, "In an unregulated capitalistic society, it appears that a boom must always have an end and lapse into crisis and depression. How can chaos be avoided once the enormous inflationary pressure and the balancing controls are simultaneously removed?" According to Murdahl, if America wanted to avoid mass unemployment, there would have to be 56 million jobs. That is 10 million jobs that had been available before the United States entered the war. At minimum, 14.5 million people were going to be released from the armed forces, from defense-based industry, and government service. If they could not find work, Murdahl predicted, the result would be, quote, "a high degree of economic unrest and a, quote, epidemic of violence." Administration economists called for the retention of wartime controls well into the post-war period. They also wanted a federal government agency to oversee demobilization and reconversion and the maintenance of full employment through government spending. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his January 1944 State of the Union address, endorsed this agenda. And in his second Bill of Rights, he conspicuously included the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms of the nation. Some of these concerns would be reflected in the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, which we just heard so much about. That promised a free college education and generous unemployment benefits to returning veterans, among other things. In January 1945, a group of liberal Democratic senators sponsored the Full Employment Act, which explicitly committed the country to a massive work relief program aimed at maintaining full employment. However, the bill languished in committee. Neither Roosevelt nor Harry Truman bothered to endorse it. The House of Representatives ended up removing many of its provisions. When it finally passed early in 1946, simply as the Employment Act, it provided for little more than the creation of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Joint Economic Committee, both of which exist to this day. But by the time the Employment Act reached Truman's desk, the war was over and conversion to a peacetime economy was well underway. Warning, economics content is coming at you. I am not an economist, but I try. Government spending in 1944 reached a peak of $96.9 billion. That represented about 44% of GNP. Immediately after Japan's surrender, the US government canceled 150,000 contracts worth $24 billion. By 1948, spending amounted to $24.2 billion, which was only 8.9% of GNP. Massive shifts in unemployment were taking place as well. Between the middle of 1945 and the middle of 1947, the personnel in the armed forces dropped from 12.12 million to 1.58 million. Add to that those in defense-related industries. There were 11 million people employed in defense-related industries. That number dropped to 0.79 million by the middle of 1947. In short, total military-related employment fell from 25.75 million, or more than 39% of the workforce, to only 3.23 million. That was just over 5% of the workforce. So massive, massive cuts. At the same time, tax rates remained for the most part at wartime levels. Some changes, but for the most part, those rates were still in place. As a result, tax revenues only dropped slightly in the post-war world, from $44.4 billion in 1945 to $41.4 billion in 1948. It's only about a 7% drop. Finally, in order to keep inflation from spiraling out of control from an expected surge in demand, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates during this period. So think about what this means if you know some basic macroeconomics. In other words, the United States government was pursuing fiscal and monetary policies from 1945 to 1947 that were highly contractionary, slashing spending, terminating government employment, keeping taxes relatively high, while the Federal Reserve at the same time raised interest rates. According to the Keynesian economic thinking that was very popular at the time, there should have been a major depression, but there wasn't. Or was there? According to the official data, the economy suffered a 20.6% drop in real GDP from 1945 to 1946. This is the worst contraction in history, even worse than 1932, which was the very worst year of the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve's index of industrial production fell by more than a third, a more dramatic drop, again, than any year of the Great Depression, or worse than anything that's happened since then. So, why does nobody remember a depression happening from 1945 to 1946? Well, there was no apparent depression because the mass employment that had been predicted simply didn't occur. In spite of this rapid demobilization, the unemployment rate only grew from about a million people, 1.9% of the workforce, to 2.4 million, or 3% of the workforce. I mean, everybody understood unemployment's going to grow, right? You don't release that many people from the civilian work, from the defense industries and the military without some increase. But of course, a 1.9% unemployment rate is like ridiculously low. That's almost never achieved. 3.9%, not bad at all. Right now, we're at 4.3%. We're higher than that right now. This seems nothing short of miraculous. Why did it happen? Well, there are a few different explanations. One is, whatever happened to Rosie the Riveter? Women left the workforce. Well, it's part of the explanation, but it's really been overstated. Consider this. In 1944, there were 18.6 million women in the workforce. They made up about 37% of the workforce. And then in 1946, it went down to 14.9 million, 32%. Okay, that's a significant difference, but not nearly as huge as you might think. It's worth noting this. Only 16% of the women in the workforce in 1944 were working in industries that were directly connected to war production, right? Rosie the Riveter is the classic example. They were not the big story of women working. Only 16% of working women had jobs like that. Of those who were not working in defense-related industry, war production, over 90% of those women still had their jobs in 1946. So we do hear about women leaving the factories. They absolutely did, whether they wanted to or not. But here's another thing, a lot of them wanted to. Many of those who left the workforce, especially those in their 20s and 30s, left voluntarily with the express purpose of starting families or returning to their families. In fact, public opinion polls during the war repeatedly showed a significant chunk of women in that age group said, yeah, as soon as the war ends, we're leaving this job. Those who remained, true, they weren't in heavy manufacturing, but the vast majority of them found their way into other jobs, in offices, restaurants, retail outlets, light industries such as textiles. So the decline in women's representation in the workforce has generally been overstated. Women made up 28% of the workforce in 1940. 4 years later, in 1944, which was probably their height, at least before recent years, they reached 37%. After the war, it didn't go back down to 28%, but leveled off at about 32%. But then look at these numbers. They steadily went up. Women's representation in the workforce continued to rise through the late 40s. By 1950, it was pretty darn close to what it had been during the war. So explanation one isn't really going to do it. How about explanation number two? Is it the GI Bill? Right? The GI Bill possibly removed huge numbers of returning soldiers from the labor force. Again, this could only be a small part of the answer. In September 1946, roughly 800,000 veterans, some 9%, were in college. Even if they had been in the labor force but had failed to find work, all 800,000 of them, that only would have increased the unemployment rate by 1.4 percentage rates. That wouldn't have been great, but we wouldn't have called that a depression either. And in fact, the GI Bill, as we just heard, offered fairly generous unemployment benefits. Not the kind of benefits you'd want to raise a family on, but if you were young and still living with your parents, you could do all right with that, $20 a week for up to 52 weeks. Roughly half of the 1.8 million unemployed in 1946 were veterans. That suggests they might have entered the workforce and might well have found work, but decided to hold off and wait for more opportunities as time went on. And in fact, in January 1946, nearly 20% of veterans indicated that they were taking vacations before returning to the civilian labor pool. Perhaps the most common explanation of all is that the economy thrived after the war because of pent-up demand. This argument was originally made by the brand new Council of Economic Advisors. Its very first report came out in December 1946. It has remained the most common explanation ever since. Right? The idea was the end of the war came, the American people said, okay, we haven't had stuff to spend on in a long time. We've got all this money burning a hole in our pockets, and they went on a rapid spending spree. Here are the problems with that. First, the extent of consumer spending has been overstated, at least for 45 to 46. Consumption did rise by about $14 billion. That did not offset more than 20% of the cuts in government spending. So it's not coming from consumption. There was a greater consumption surge in the late 1946 and 1947, but that can't explain why unemployment remained as low as it did in 45 and 46. Secondly, if prosperity was simply the result of postponed consumer demand, then it should have been very temporary, right? Eventually, okay, we're done spending on stuff. That's not the case. Yeah, there was a brief recession in 1949. October of 1949, unemployment spiked at 7.9%, but it quickly dropped after that. By summer of 1951, it was down to 3%, which is lower even than it had been in 1946. Finally, the pent-up demand theory assumes that consumers went on a spending spree using the savings they'd been forced to accumulate during the war. In fact, and I'm going to gloss over this, liquid assets had reached a height in 1945, but they kept going up, 168.5 billion by 1947. So they were spending money, yeah, but they hadn't stopped saving, right? And they weren't digging into their savings accounts to buy this stuff. Anybody who's had relatives who lived through the Depression, they were like some of the tightest people you could imagine. They're not the type that were going to go blowing through their savings accounts. So if those explanations don't do it, what's the answer? Well, I think the best answer is why the economy did not return to depression conditions at the end of the war is that businesses and consumers finally, for the first time since the late 1920s, had confidence in the future. During the war, Americans had seen their incomes rise, but they also had to work under unprecedented constraints, rationing, price controls, all sorts of regulations. During the war, in fact, it's not too much to say that the United States became a planned economy. Virtually all economic activity was controlled to some extent through an often confusing and constantly changing set of rules. Americans looked forward as the war started winding down to an economy with far fewer controls. But the story of rising confidence begins even before the war. During the later New Deal years, 1937, 1938, a new generation of reformers came to occupy important places in the administration. They believed that the reforms that had been carried out under Roosevelt so far had been insufficient, and they wanted a considerable expansion in the size and scope of government to manage the economy. Well, ordinarily, you would think Franklin Roosevelt would be with them, but by 1939, FDR had different priorities. He started to be a lot more interested in foreign affairs than in domestic reform. As he once put it in a speech or at a press conference, Dr. New Deal has gone away and has been replaced by Dr. Win the War. His greatest enemies for the next 2.5 years were not the economic royalists that he had denounced back in 1936, but rather isolationists were his enemy now. And in fact, some of the isolationists that he was attacking in 1940 and 41 had been among his chief political allies a few years earlier. The president also needed new friends in this fight, and many of those were internationally oriented Republicans from the Northeast and conservative Democrats from the South. In fact, in 1940, he starts adding prominent Republicans to his cabinet. Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, Henry Stimson as Secretary of War. There are others farther down the chain. This marked a dramatic change in administration strategy. When the country actually went to war after Pearl Harbor, it was understood that there was going to be significant planning of the economy. But it was also clear that the planners were going to come in large part from the ranks of business. It didn't take long, though, for the business interests and the New Dealers to clash over the question of demobilization. The former business executives were afraid that the administration might use the war as an excuse to keep the economy under permanent state control. Indeed, this is one of the greatest motivations for why about 10,000 business executives volunteered to serve as $1-a-year men. That is, their salary was $1 for the entire year in federal war agencies. They were able to make common cause not only with conservatives in Congress, but also with the U.S. military to make sure that once the fighting was over, the economic controls and the agencies of economic planning would quickly disappear. Here's a quote from a report from the War Resources Board, which was an agency headed by former U.S. Steel Chairman Edward R. Stettinius. Edward R. Stettinius would go on to be Secretary of State, by the way. This report said, American businessmen, like all Americans, are accustomed to democratic procedures. More effectiveness can be obtained through voluntary cooperation than through force. We recommend that wartime powers be vested in specially created wartime agencies, which will be automatically demobilized when the war is over. We therefore do not recommend centralization of power in a new super agency or the delegation of power to existing peacetime agencies. Well, the New Dealers pushed back. They argued for a continuation of controls and other things that I've already mentioned, public spending to keep the economy at full employment. But they were hamstrung, thanks in part to the rise of conservatives in Congress. This was a story that began with the elections of 1938, continued over the next 7 years. Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats were getting stronger and stronger. But they were also hurt, the New Dealers were also hurt by the weakness of their primary allies, labor unions. As the war was going on, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations seemed a lot more interested in fighting against one another than they were in resisting corporate power. And it didn't help that many of organized labor's most experienced leaders were enlisted or drafted into the armed forces. Well, hey, we lost our visual, sorry. Well, okay. For his part, Roosevelt remained aloof from this struggle. Of course, he's preoccupied by wartime matters and also his increasingly failing health. Roosevelt died in April 1945, leaving Harry Truman to address the problems of wartime conversion. Here's the thing about Harry Truman. He had a reputation as a loyal supporter of the New Deal, but he did not really trust many of these bright young men who were clamoring for more extensive reforms in 1945 and onward. He called them, quote, the long-haired boys, the liberal crowd, the Harvard crowd. Some of the more radical members of the cabinet, such as Harold Ickes and Henry Wallace, did not last long in the Truman administration. Aside from that, Truman in 1945-46 remained too focused on international affairs to give much attention to the problems of reconversion. Look, Truman's right next to that. Yes, that's Herbert Hoover, right? The guy that no Democrat would touch for years, but Truman actually made overtures to Hoover. Once Republicans took control of Congress in the 1946 midterms, the chances for further New Deal-style reform seemed to say the least, slim. Well, the return of business confidence produced multiple effects, more economics content. That line on top shows the dramatic drop in GDP, 1945 to 1946, but look what's going on at the bottom. That is private GDP, right? That part of gross domestic product that was made up of private business. It soared 29.5%. That is unprecedented. We've never seen a 29.5% increase in private GDP in 1 year. Second, gross private investment, which had languished throughout the Depression, finally bounced back. In 1941, it had reached $19.37 billion. That was the first year that the gross private investment had exceeded 1929 levels. But then it fell during World War II. 1946, it came roaring back, an unprecedented $33.13 billion. Clearly, government spending during the war had been crowding out private investment. Businesses also enjoyed high profitability. Look, that straight line there, that pretty much continues throughout the war. I mean, it's decent profits. Companies were making money, 10 to 11 billion a year. That fell to about 9 billion with the termination of wartime contracts, but then it came roaring back after that. 22.7 billion in profits by 1948. Finally, Wall Street rebounded strongly. At the same time that official GDP was falling, the stock market actually rose 18%. By September 1945, the Dow Jones finally exceeded the levels it had reached in 1937. It would not be until July 1954 that the stock market would return to the dizzying heights of 1929. So, the rapid demobilization of this period and the quick relaxation of economic controls did not lead to a return to depression conditions, even though economists at the time predicted it. The U.S. economy from 1945 to 48 showed a degree of health and vigor that had not been seen since the 1920s. The key to this rapid recovery was confidence. Business owners looked forward to an end of wartime controls, and they invested accordingly. Likewise, by late 1946, consumers sensed that conditions were not going to get worse, there wasn't going to be a depression, and they started buying durable goods once again. But there's one more mystery that I will leave you with. How could official GDP register such a massive loss without producing any of the consequences that have always gone along with it? Well, the economic historian Robert Higgs suggests that this is the problem. The wartime GDP figures are fundamentally unreliable. And his reason for saying that is government spending accounted for nearly half the economy. And prices were not set by supply and demand, but rather through a bunch of rules and cost-plus contracts. Without prices, it's hard to figure out what the GDP is. And thanks to wage and price controls, it was very difficult to try to measure the effects that inflation would have had if those controls hadn't been there. So according to Higgs, the economic figures like GDP were just about as reliable as the periodic economic reports released by the Soviet Union. They're pretty much. It's entirely possible that GDP during the war years considerably overstated the country's economic performance, and that the huge drop from 1945 to 1946 simply reflected a shift from inflated numbers to accurate ones. If that's true, we have to revisit the standard narrative that it was World War II that brought an end to the Great Depression. But that's a subject for a different paper. Thanks.
I'm going to start by just noting how much I've learned from these excellent scholars that have been part of this conference this weekend. I have learned a lot, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. I am not a professional historian of World War II, but I've always been interested in the stories that I've heard about the men and women who experienced World War II. And that fascination began when I was a young boy because I would hear stories from my grandfather about his experiences in World War II. I grew up with these stories. He served in the Big Red One, 1st Infantry Division, 5th Field Artillery Battalion, as he was always proud of telling me, in Patton's Third Army. And despite what you might have seen in Hollywood's attempts at painting Patton as hated by his men, my grandfather loved Patton. Loved him all the way through the war. So after landing in Europe, just after D-Day, my grandfather made his way across France, then into Germany, after defending the Ludendorff Bridge at the Battle of Remagen, and then from Berlin into Czechoslovakia, where he was dishonorably discharged and then shipped home. So most of the time, the stories he told were usually of the good memories, kind of like adventure tales that he had had with his buddies on a little trollop or ramble across France. And it wasn't until one occasion in the mid-1990s that he actually finally opened up to me privately and told me of some of the really hard times, the loss of friends, told me about some of the really heartbreaking and terrible things that he had seen in those years. That was the first time in my life I had seen tears in my grandfather's eyes. At about the same time, this is around 1995, I was a college student here at Ashland University majoring in history, and a friend and fellow student of mine, Paul Worthington, I had hoped that he might show up today so I could acknowledge him. He very graciously invited me, he was also a history major, he very graciously invited me to start interviewing World War II POWs living in Ohio with him. And so we would go to their homes, video and audio record the interviews, transcribe everything, transcribe the tapes, and then make copies of everything for the POWs and their families. We interviewed, I would say, around 20 POWs, most of them Americans captured by Germans and a few captured by the Japanese. As with my grandfather, we found that many of these men had not spoken much, if at all, about their experiences in World War II, or at least had not opened up about some of the tougher things they had seen, even to their families. Suddenly, however, this is 1995 again, it seemed that many of them were willing to speak. Perhaps it was an awareness that their generation was rapidly reaching their twilight years, or maybe it was the 50th anniversary of the end of the war that brought them out. I'm not quite sure. But the men we interviewed finally wanted their experiences on record, if only for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know their stories. Why did they remain silent for so long? The answer to that question varied among them. For a few, they felt that what they had done was underappreciated by the people and government of the United States. Many felt frustration at being taken out of the fight upon capture and not being able to contribute directly to the war effort. For others still, some of the memories of their experiences and the things they witnessed were simply too emotionally painful. Some still had dreams, nightmares about being shot down in their B-17s or B-24s, other of the long, brutal marches, the hunger, the deaths of friends, and others could still vividly recall the names and faces of particularly nasty guards. At the end of this talk, I'll turn a little bit and make some remarks about how these POWs coped with their experiences upon returning home. But to get to that, I want to briefly recount the stories of two of these POWs that we interviewed, one who was captured by the Germans and the other captured by the Japanese. The first is named Jim V. I won't give his full name, his real name. We'll just call him Jim. He was born in Pennsylvania. He joined the Army Air Corps in October of 1942. After finishing gunnery school, he was assigned to a B-17 Flying Fortress crew as a top turret gunner and flight engineer in the 8th Air Force 91st Bomb Group stationed in England. Flight missions for these bomber crews were grueling affairs, often lasting 8 or 9 hours in the air, sometimes 11 or more hours, arriving back at base on nearly empty tanks. On his very first mission, Jim's crew bombed Berlin and took heavy flak, losing oxygen for the return trip and limping back to England at 12,000 feet. Very dangerous. His squadron was the first to be attacked by the German Comet rocket planes, and they were so fast that Jim accidentally put some rounds through the B-17 flying next to his. Fortunately, there were no casualties, and they laughed about it when they got back. But you couldn't keep up with them. Among his many missions, Jim flew to Nuremberg, Leipzig, Regensburg, Hanover, Frankfurt, even into Posen, Poland. They hit the German submarine pens at Wilhelmshaven and V-2 rocket launch sites along the coast of France. Jim's B-17 was finally shot down during a raid on a chemical plant outside of Leipzig in 1943. Not, however, before Jim, from his top turret, shot down a German Me-109, for which he, 40 years later, received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Bleeding badly from shrapnel wounds, Jim was shoved out of his plane by his co-pilot, one of only 4 of the crew that made it out, and dropped under his parachute toward the ground. I was floating down, Jim recalled, and I could hear the air battle still going up in the air above me. And then a German plane came and circled me. I thought he was going to machine gun me, but he just waved and took off. Next thing, I could hear the birds singing, and then people yelling and screaming. And I looked down at a bunch of civilians shaking their pitchforks and shovels at me. When he saw the civilians, Jim very prudently threw away his .45 pistol. But they started, upon landing, beating him pretty badly. He was rescued from the civilians by 2 Wehrmacht infantrymen. Otherwise, Jim said, I'm sure they would have killed me. He was transported to a Gestapo headquarters at Hohenstein, where he was interrogated and then bandaged up. After a few weeks of recovering from his wounds, he was put on a train to Dulag Luft near Frankfurt am Main. Jim recalls some acts of civility from German soldiers and officers to him and his fellow American airmen there, but upon reaching Dulag Luft, he was immediately placed in solitary confinement for 5 days. After being interrogated by a blonde German officer who had lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and spoke perfect English, Jim was transported to a transit camp at Wetzlar, loading supplies on German military trains for about 3 weeks. Eventually, Jim ended up at Stalag Luft 4 in what is now Poland, where he would spend most of the duration of the war. Rules were very strict with regard to when and where prisoners could walk about, and good food was always in short supply. His diet consisted mainly of potatoes, barley soup, sauerkraut, and occasionally some kind of mystery meat, including on one occasion a cat and her 6 little kittens. There's no awes from the audience over that? Sorry. Okay. They're starving, just so you know, right? Okay. They didn't normally do that. Okay, all right, good. In addition to the hunger, cold, sickness, bed bugs, and lice, Jim said that boredom was the men's worst enemy. The men occupied their time playing cards, cribbage, baseball, anything that would keep their minds off home or the memories of being shot down. They held church services quite frequently. I never met a heathen in prison camp, Jim said. But he also recalled many times that he would hear men having nightmares and crying in their bunks at night, reliving the deaths of friends and crewmates. As the war continued, rations became tighter. The German guards also began suffering shorter supplies and would often steal Red Cross boxes and other parcels intended for the POWs. As treatment by the Germans became worse, Jim recalls that acts of sabotage on the part of POWs increased. They would often stick razor blades in bars of soap, knowing that the German guards would steal them and use them. Or they would unscrew light bulbs and fill them with petrol so that when the guards screwed them back in, they would explode in their faces. Eventually, someone managed to smuggle a radio into the camp, and the POWs quietly passed along news of the war to each other. Jim recalls hearing of the initial setback and eventual Allied victory at the Battle of the Bulge. He also surmised that the war was going badly for the Germans when he saw more American and British planes flying over the camp at lower altitudes. Fearing the Russian advance from the east, the Germans eventually rounded up the POWs in late January of 1945 for a long, cold, hungry march to the south with very little food or supplies. At one point on the march, Jim saw some milk cans near a farmhouse, and he and some other men, prisoners, suffering badly from dehydration, ran for the milk cans. A guard hit Jim in his face with his rifle butt, breaking his nose and knocking out all of his front teeth. Unable to eat anything, Jim now feared that he would starve to death before he would freeze. So he agreed to let the American camp doctor cauterize his gums with a red-hot knife. Eventually, many of the German guards who had begun the march slipped away, knowing the war would soon be over. On one occasion, some guards told Jim and several other POWs that they had orders to execute them, but they would not do so if the POWs signed a paper stating that those guards had treated them well and helped them to escape. Jim and the others signed without hesitation. Eventually, Jim was commandeered by an SS squad to bury the bodies of murdered Jews outside the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen. This is a quote from Jim. There had to be maybe 20,000 dead bodies at that camp, stacked up in piles out there in the field. There was one big pit, and they had us drag the bodies over there and push them in. At this point in the interview, Jim broke down and cried. A few minutes later, he was able to continue. The bodies were nothing but skin and bone. The flesh would slough off in your hands as you dragged them into the pit. You just wiped your hands in the dirt. There was nothing else you could do. Jim actually considered suicide on the second day of that hell. It was that bad. Fortunately for him, he did not have to do that, because on the fourth day, he was able to sneak away, making his way alone toward the west until he finally ran into some advanced squads of Allied soldiers and was officially liberated. From there, he was sent off to Camp Lucky Strike in France and then on a ship from Cherbourg, France for home. I'll say more about Jim at the end, about what it was like for him to come over or to come home after the war. But the second POW I want to mention is Glenn. Born in California, he joined the Army Air Corps in 1940. He was eventually assigned as ground crew for a support squadron and shipped out from San Francisco in September of 1941 for Clark Field in Luzon, the Philippines. Glenn recalls how under-equipped and unprepared the Army was for any real fighting at the base when news reached them of the attack on Pearl Harbor. At first, he said, the men didn't believe the news on the radio was real. Some of them thought they were listening to another fictional Orson Welles broadcast. The next day, it became very real, as Japanese planes began bombing and strafing the American bases, including Clark Field, destroying most of their aircraft. Unprepared to defend the base, Jim and the remaining American troops abandoned Clark Field, regrouped, and tried to form a defensive line across the Bataan Peninsula against the invading Japanese army. With nothing to eat but rice, lacking clean drinking water and medical supplies, with most men suffering from jaundice, malaria, dysentery, or pneumonia, the Americans held out for 4 months until formally surrendering to the Japanese on April 9th, 1942. Glenn and the Americans, in groups of about 200 men, began the deadly march up the Bataan Peninsula to San Fernando. Among other atrocities, he remembered seeing 2 Americans shot by Japanese soldiers for leaving the line to get some water from a well. Over the next 7 days, Glenn marched over 60 miles on dirt roads and jungle paths and was finally lucky enough to be picked up by a truck for the last leg of the trek. At San Fernando, he was packed into a boxcar with 150 other men, traveled by train overnight to Camp O'Donnell near Capas. Conditions were so bad at that camp that Glenn recalls losing about 50 to 60 men every day. Sick from malaria and dysentery, Glenn and the others had to dig that many 3x12 graves just about every day for weeks. You just pushed them in, he said, down in, and covered them up. No ceremonies, no flag, no nothing. You didn't dare, or you would be shot and put in there yourself. And after a while, you get immune to it, except for the smell, he said. The smell of death is something you never forget. After months of this hell at Camp O'Donnell, Glenn was sent to another POW camp at Cabanatuan, and there he recalls that POWs, as they entered the camp, were forced to look at a gate post upon which the heads of 2 decapitated American officers had been stuck. Eventually, Glenn learned that the POWs were being shipped to work on Japan, and so to avoid this, he volunteered to work on a truck detail at Camp McKinley near Manila. He and 75 other POWs drove American-made trucks, hauling materials left behind by Americans to the ports to be loaded on ships for Japan, including everything from sand and gravel to nails and typewriters, whatever they could get their hands on. Each American driver was accompanied by a guard in the passenger seat. Living only on rice and tea, Glenn did this 6 days a week from September 1942 to October of 1943, so for over a year. He and the others were beaten at times for what seemed to Glenn to be the most ridiculous of reasons. Making a mistake counting to 100 in Japanese, or not agreeing to help a Japanese officer steal items to ship back to their families at home. When the occasion presented itself, American POWs did their small part in the work of sabotage. Those working the docks, for example, loading the ships by crane, would accidentally drop crates into the bay, or men would open the plugs on fuel tanks at night until they would bleed out empty. All of this time, Glenn had no news of how the war was going elsewhere. When there was little left to pillage from the Philippines, Glenn was loaded on a ship with 1,500 other American POWs, not knowing that he was being taken to Japan. Glenn and 900 of those POWs were packed into a cargo hold approximately 30 by 60 feet in size. Living on half a canteen of water and 2 small bowls of rice per day, Glenn spent the next 6 weeks in that cargo hold, emerging only once to load supplies on Taiwan. Many men died in that hold, their bodies unceremoniously tossed into the sea by the Japanese. In addition to the hunger, dehydration, and sickness, Glenn recalled that his greatest fear was being attacked or being torpedoed, by allies. When the ships were strafed by American planes, the Japanese soldiers would close the cargo hatches, and Glenn, in the pitch black below, would have to listen to the fighting and the machine gun fire above. Between disease and these Allied attacks on this 11-ship convoy, 5,200 POWs died on that trip. After arriving at Kobe on Honshu in Japan, Glenn was taken to a camp at a lead mine near Kamioki, where he worked 6 days a week, loading blasted ore into rail cars with a hoe and a hand scoop, 700 feet underground, from September of 1944 until the end of the war. Glenn recalled that oddly, they were not called to work on August 14th of 1945, nor on the next day. Finally, Glenn awoke on August 17th to see that all the Japanese guards had abandoned the camp. He and the others remained there until word of the formal surrender arrived on September 5th. And then he was finally able to get a spot on a C-54 transport, first to Okinawa, and from there he was flown on a B-24 Liberator back to where he started, Clark Field in the Philippines. So these are just 2 of the really remarkable stories of the POWs that we had the honor of interviewing. What about returning home? Among the POWs that we interviewed, how they adjusted to home life varied greatly among them. They all, of course, were eager to return to their families or girlfriends, to find jobs, start living life. Some of them dealt with permanent physical disabilities or illnesses as a result of the brutal treatment they had received at the hands of their captors or diseases they had contracted in their prison camps. Jim weighed 170 pounds when he was captured by the Germans and 102 when he was liberated. He had nightmares for years, he said, about being shot down, about being beaten by the German civilians and smelling the rotting flesh at Bergen-Belsen. And he would often wake up in the middle of the night punching and kicking his wife in bed. Jim says he got counseling from the VA, which helped some, but many other POWs, as Stephanie pointed out, very quickly gave up seeking aid from the VA, which didn't seem prepared to understand the particular physical and mental health issues that were unique to POWs. Jim also recalled the terrible effect his capture had had on his father, who had suffered a stroke, possibly from worrying about him. Expecting a joyful return home, Jim recalls, "My father didn't recognize me. He just stared off into space. Till the day he died in 1947, he didn't know me." Glenn also recalled that when he had enlisted, he was about 160 pounds. When he was liberated from the mining camp in Japan, he weighed 80 pounds. After his liberation, he realized that one of the hardest things he had endured was not being able to see the American flag for 4 years. He says, "One of my pet peeves today is how people treat the American flag. I keep one up 24 hours every day." He remained in the service and retired from the Air Force in 1981, but he says he didn't really talk about his experiences as a POW until much later. For nearly 50 years, even fellow members of the various POW organizations that had grown didn't talk much about their personal experiences. Why, we asked him. Well, most of the guys got married back home, he said, and they thought their wives wouldn't want to hear about this stuff all the time. Others said they just wanted to forget about it and move on. Several said, well, we didn't really do anything special or deserve any more honor than every other man and woman who served in World War II. While some of these POWs said that they held no grudges against their captors, or at least against the German or Japanese people, Some grievances did endure. Jim recalled one German guard in particular. They called him Big Stoop. You can guess what that's short for. 6'7" with a devilish goatee who would often torment prisoners in various ways for no reason. Jim recalled how on Christmas Eve of 1944, Big Stoop caught him alone getting water from the pump at night. Laughing like a demon, Big Stoop grabbed him by his genitals and lifted him into the air. Jim was hobbled for months after this. If I had run across Big Stoop after the war, he said, I would have cut his throat and slept like a baby. Fortunately, Jim did not have to do this because Big Stoop was captured by the British and executed for war crimes. Glenn also recalled his particular guard from when he drove his truck, named Hasamoto, who beat him severely on occasion. One time, Glenn slowed to let a Filipino girl cross the street, and Hasamoto whacked him right in the face with his club, then had him pull over to the side of the road so that he can beat him even more with his fists and step on him with his hobnail boots. Glenn told us in the interview, I later wished I had driven that truck into a pole and thrown him through the windshield. By the way, I've cleaned up some of these remarks for this audience, a little bit. He also mentioned that for a long time, if he had to interact with anyone Asian, a doctor, for example, didn't matter whether they were Japanese or Korean or Chinese, he would black out and go back to his time as a POW. Now, I've read other historical accounts of POWs feeling guilt and shame at having been captured, but the POWs we interviewed did not have these feelings. They had all served honorably and faced great danger before being captured. However, many of them still felt what you might call frustration at being forced out of the fight, unable to contribute in any direct way other than the attempts at escape or sabotage to the war effort. Nonetheless, for all of them, it was clear that even as POWs, their hearts were still in the fight. These men should be forever remembered as heroes and honored as much as anyone who served or died in the Allied cause during World War II. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. We have a few minutes for questions. Dr. Pullen. Oh, okay. Well, okay. We've got 13 minutes, so we'll try to make it fairly quick.
That'd be quick. First, I'll ask my questions first. Moser, how is your thesis different than Ralph Nader's Only the Rich Can Save Us? Two, Professor Hinnershitz, could you expand a bit more on the intellectual content that was being by the GI Bill in Chris, I do have the privilege of being a veteran, Soviet, British, American. What do you think about the psychology of different Americans, British on the one hand, and Soviets on the other? When I could read Soviets, they would talk about their experience in grotesque and almost graphic and grotesque. There's Americans and British, they were all hardly anyone knew what they were talking about. What do you think about that? Those are my questions.
I've never read the book you're talking about, so I don't have an answer.
Thanks so much, John.
Oh, okay, my turn. Sorry. Yes, sorry, I was getting into the book. So that is a really good question. I'll start backwards a little bit and then, work back. So two of the more recent iterations of the bill. So the GI Bill has gone through a number of different, I think there's a couple different ones. So there's the Forever Bill, which is the post 9/11 one, and then I think there was another iteration, but they are really focused on STEM. So there's a big push to give more degrees or give more assistance for STEM degrees. And then, as far as like over the 20th century, there's a couple different ways that I could answer this, and I will not do it very long, but law. So the ability of veterans to go to law school. So mention like like Medgar Evers is one. He did not go to law school, but that is really, really key, right? Some of the big players, McNamara, right? So some of these who are able to go on, use the GI Bill, and then use that in a policy sense and a legal sense. You've got others who go to get college degrees and have literary careers. It's just, I don't know if that's exactly what you're going for.
My question is really, is America better off intellectually and then?
Oh, yeah.
Economically we have Bill?
Yeah.
And cost international.
Oh, well, there you go. So I gave you a couple.
Be Moser.
Oh, okay, yeah, no. So Medgar Evers, Daniel Inouye. There's I think a couple, more than a couple, but there was a book that came out called The Young Lions about Jewish American authors. So there's like a number who will go and get their degrees and then become novelists. Yes. So the short answer is yes, because there's so many abilities that people had to go to school and get degrees and then are able to go through and create lasting careers.
Well, I didn't interview any Germans or Russians or British on this, but maybe if I could flip it around for a second, there's clearly a reason why at the end of the war, the Germans were fleeing west to be captured rather than east, right? And they had heard, I mean, there was going to be they were going to be put to death. There was no intention on the part of the Russians to intern Germans for any long period of time. The one thing I can say anecdotally about that is that Jim, who I was talking about, the American POW who had been captured by the Germans, when he escaped from Bergen-Belsen, he also, he went west because he knew that's where the Americans were, but he also was trying to avoid coming into contact with the Russians. And I'm not sure if I should even tell this story because it was off camera. He didn't want us to record this. He had an encounter with some Russian soldiers in a village. So remember, his face is all broken up. And he escapes from Bergen-Belsen. He's marching west. He comes into a village. A German widow and her young daughter sort of were nursing him back to health. And when Jim was healthy enough, a few days later, he went out to look for some food for them. When he came back, he had found 2 Russian soldiers had come and done terrible things to the mother and the daughter. They were both dead. And before Jim continued going west, he found those 2 Russians and took care of them. He was crying when he told us this story. So my only reason I mention this is even POWs who were escaping didn't want to come into contact with the Russians. They would rather continue forging for themselves westward until they came into contact with allies before they would turn themselves over to Russians and count on them to return them to the West. So it's pretty nasty. And I just add one more thing, though. It's not quite on your question. We also interviewed some Germans and Italians who had been captured by Americans. And the 3 Germans who had been captured by Americans, they were sent over to camps in the United States. 2 of them first went to North Carolina, and then they were all sort of sent into camps in various parts of the Midwest. They loved it. They were amazed, right? You've heard this. One of the guys named Dave, German named David, not a very German name, I guess. The camp commandant, the American commandant of the camp would say, "Look, you lazy bums, get out of this. I want you out of this camp at 8 o'clock in the morning. Go find a job, do something useful with yourselves, and be back by 10 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night." They would leave the camp and they would go help out the local people on the farms, and they made friends and learned what America was like in a way, right? At least what the Midwest was like. And so they were able to actually make friends, and then all of them ended up having to go home eventually to Germany, but then as soon as they could, they applied for citizenship. And they had sponsors in the people that they had worked for in Iowa, South Dakota. I forget where the other place was, but it's a totally different experience.
Yes.
I don't think they were treated, I think it's unfair and unjust what happened to the Japanese at the internment camps. I could tell you stories of things that happened. Again, I left a lot out for sensitivity's sake. I could tell you stories. Another interview, POW that we interviewed, was captured by the Japanese. He was actually underwater in Manila Bay doing salvage work for the Navy. And when he came up, everything was on fire. And he ended up on the Bataan Death March. He, for example, I'm trying to think one of his milder stories that he told. Occasionally, the Japanese guards had them, the POWs, the American POWs, come out and they dug a trench about 10 inches wide and about 12 inches deep. And they would dig this long trench, and then they would have them lay down, sit down, and stretch their legs across the trench. And the guards, every so often, for whatever reason, would just randomly walk up and decide to take a bat and break somebody's legs over the trench, like crack. And then they go to the next guy and look at him, skip 3 people, crack. And that's just one story of many bad things that we learned from our interview. So I think what happened to the Japanese is totally unfair and unjust, and the internment camps unjustifiable in many ways. But as far as the actual treatment, no comparison. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I misunderstood your question. Like how we treated oh, yes. Oh, I see. I totally misunderstood your question. Yeah, that's right. The Japanese wouldn't be captured, right? So there were relatively few Japanese POWs captured because they didn't want to be captured, right? Again, I don't want to overdo this, but we interviewed the 3 Germans and the Italian. They all said that initially they resisted. They didn't want to be POWs, and they continued to be loyal to the war effort on the part of their country. It did not take them long to see that there was something special, if not odd, about the way Americans treated their POWs. It was totally different than what they were used to. I don't know about, again, the Japanese, how Americans treated the Japanese as much, but I only know this from my interviewing of these 3 Germans and this Italian guy who by all accounts had a pretty good, this sounds overdoing it, but they had a pretty good time in camp. I mean, they missed their home and all of this, but they became Americans during their time as prisoners. So.
Yes, we've got a question here.
In order to get like the, oh, I see. So yeah, there were insurance benefits and things like that were tied more directly to the actual service member. And then in some of the later bills, like more recent iterations for GI Bill benefits for children to be able to go to college. So that wasn't immediate. That takes a little bit of, forget which iteration of that, but yeah, it took a little bit longer for some of those benefits for immediate family members, but initially very focused on the actual member themselves.
In the back.
Oh, they're all such great people. I could say good things about all of them. I'll just say about one in particular who was a ball turret gunner on a B-17. I don't know if you've ever seen a B-17. I had the pleasure of flying in one once, but these POWs we were interviewing actually got me onto a B-17. I think it was a B-17F, and I got to fly in it. And these planes are so weird on the inside. You kind of have to crawl from one place to another. There's hardly any room. I tried to fit in the ball turret. I couldn't get into it. But he would be balled up in this turret. And then ball turret gunners had the highest rate of deaths of anybody on a flight crew during World War II. This guy was just an amazing guy. Because of his particular size, he ended up being a ball turret gunner. And they were particularly brave, I think, to do that, because if that plane took damage or it had to land without wheels, they were dead, and they all knew it. They weren't getting out. So I could think of many great examples of courage and honor on the part of these guys. So, yeah.
Yes.
My question is, are you familiar with the term
I'm not.
Teams, sports teams, countries of war, even the way the Japanese prepared their naval ships, air capture, never thought they would be defeated, never thought that they would be damaged. So, move on to the question. The Japanese felt that they would always win, and consequently they could dispose of prisoners, with their skill. We don't need those guys. We're going to get so many prisoners, conquer their protectorate of the Pacific. Is that something that you saw with your interviews of these veterans, or the differences between being a German POW and a Japanese POW? My understanding that your probability of survival as a German POW is much higher than a Japanese POW. Is that victory seized? Was that something that might have been a part of, we're never going to lose, we're going to have so many POWs, we can treat people like gods?
I'm sure it probably was. I didn't hear any of that from the POWs themselves. They were just trying to survive day to day and try to piece together, what they could of what was going on. I'm sure that probably had a factor. That was a factor in the difference between the way the Americans captured by the Japanese were treated versus those captured by the Germans. But yeah, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, look, so the POW, look, when you're interviewing these POWs, first of all, I had to be very, very careful, as you can understand, how I would ask questions, right? Because I didn't want to trigger, breakdowns and things like this. So we tried to avoid asking them questions that were sort of pointed in a way. I wanted to know what on your point, what they thought the motivation was for the Japanese in treating them in that way. And what I was expecting them to hear was, I heard some of us talking over lunch about the racial aspects, that the Japanese thought that they were the superior race, and that they considered Americans and Europeans to be almost at the level of dogs and things like that. And occasionally some of the POWs would say they heard Japanese make references like that, but it wasn't as common as you might think. And I don't know if that's because it wasn't true, it probably was. But it was more that the POWs were so hungry and starving and thinking about getting by to the next day, dealing with the diseases they couldn't quite make sense of it. So
it's my understanding also that when a Japanese soldier was trained in their basic training, that they were beaten on by their superiors during their basic training.
Yeah.
And so for them to beat up a POW.
Yep. What's interesting is, sorry, can I just say, I'm trying to be quick. So one of the POWs, in fact, it was Glenn, actually mentioned that he was, not him, but another driver of the trucks was beaten really bad, so badly by his Japanese guard, that he couldn't drive for weeks. That guard disappeared for 2 weeks, and when he finally showed up 3 weeks later, he had been beaten by his commanding officer extraordinarily badly for beating that American prisoner. Not because it was bad treatment, but because they lost a driver. So there's that whole system is built, it's all built into the system.
Yeah. Well, thank you to, no. We were going to have to cut it here because we're 3 minutes over. We can continue, I know, but you can continue the conversation afterwards. The panelists will be available, but I want to make sure we maintain time, because in 12 minutes, we're coming back for our closing keynote. So thank you to all panelists.
Jen, is this yours? Did I steal this from you?
Nope, you can take it.
Yep. Yes.
She was there for the funeral. He's from Montana. You have to read it.
Just let it. Yep. If you didn't do anything outwardly, it was just totally. Yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
They're a husband and wife.
Yep. As long as there was no official, that we're good. Yep.
The research is off the charts.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
That's the time I spent down there. I did the MCS down there.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Now,
Very cool.
when you use NOA as an example, this is something else you should look at. The Asian Pacific Center for Strategic Studies that you started.
That's, yeah,
I did a consult for them back pre-COVID.
yeah.
They're doing some interesting work on trying to get leadership groups in the Pacific talking to one another on business.
Very important.
Navigation,
Yeah.
volcano and earthquake and disease relief.
Yeah.
They're doing some really interesting stuff. So when we talk about
Yeah,
these contributions, that's one you might keep in mind.
No, very good. Yep, absolutely. Thank
Take care.
you.
Have a safe trip home.
Thank you. Very early flight tomorrow.
It's
Super early.
difficult to get in and out of, and yeah.
It is. Sometimes I just drive the 2 hours to Atlanta
Yeah, I understand.
for a direct flight. So.
Conferences down there, and I did years ago.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay, very cool. Very cool. Nice to meet
I
you.
left this for you. That's my email. But sir, I would certainly invite us. Now, here's my request to you besides reading the book. I would love to have a copy of this to read to my students. Okay, I'm part of the Veterans History Project out of Sarasota, my high school. And I was going to ask you a question about people who live through concentration camps. That's some of the experiences. I'm going to have to read this book. I really do. And if I could put she's in the presentation all over Ohio.
Great question.
You said that before.
What accounts for the upturn in corporate spending?
Well, that's right.
Okay. And I know that was the.
I can give you some more stories. I could talk about her. Well, she went to Baltimore, but she now works in Cleveland. But this guy, Ben Steele, was here before that. And he went to the Cleveland Art Institute to become an artist. I have 3 of his paintings. I can't remember the name of his geology experience. Yes. Oh, we could go on and on. You could have a conference just on.
Dr. Burkett, I'm sorry to interrupt you. And at the risk of interrupting, my question is less.
All right, Dr. Frank, can you hear me?
Basically,
We cannot hear you yet, so I will figure this out.
I also interviewed veterans, American, British, Soviets. Americans and Brits, when they came back home, so few of their family, friends, peers had
What
any.
do you mean?
Despite the Blitz or Pearl Harbor, they had no idea what.
How are you doing that?
Russians came home, none of them had sympathy for the Soviets.
No output
So these
devices
people,
found.
despite the savagery of what I think, my wife's a former Soviet, despite the savagery.
What do you mean, no?
many of them, I think the Soviets actually processed psychologically better than the Americans. It's a theory I have. Yeah, well, I mean, you come back and 3/4 of your family's murdered. You come back to America and what, Rosie the Riveter, Frederick March, you know. How have you been? That was really well.
I misunderstood.
No, that's fair. I didn't articulate it well.
I heard there's
That said, yes, and I'm really glad that. I don't think I'll get you, Dr. Frank. I'm really glad that was the way it is. Because I'll tell you what, hell, a lot more.
There was a resurgence of.
What did I have to do?
And then it's since then it's sort of downhill in terms of.
Let me try a few other things.
Pacific.
You're fine.
I have a story I'll share with you well after the conference. Pacific and Europe. Tell you what,
I have a question for you, so I'll hit you up there. Thank you, sir.
Chris,
I
seriously.
guarantee this might be the best book. I've got to read it. Okay, and I would love to get a copy so I can read that. Thank you. Yes, sir, that's my email. That's okay. That's okay. But yeah, that's my email.
All right, I have an idea.
Thank you.
Where's my, there it is. Oh, it's being mean to me. There we go.